Good morning. Welcome to everyone. We are in day 3 of the Jersey Waterworks conference for the Why Affordability Matters, Understanding Water and Sewer Burdens and Tailoring Solutions workshop. So I am Renee Kubiatis. We encourage you to use the chat to connect with us, ask questions in the Q&A feature as well. And we will also have a scavenger hunt question on Jersey Water Check towards the end of our workshop, so be on the lookout for that. And I am, again, Renee Kubianis, the Anti-Poverty Program Director at New Jersey Citizen Action, where I oversee the Anti-Poverty Network statewide, which is a coalition that has existed for 22 years and focus on issues of deep poverty. And I'd like to turn it over to Daniel Van Abs to introduce himself. Sorry, and there's also a poll on your screen. So please make your selection while we're introducing ourselves. So Dan, could you introduce yourself? I don't hear you if you're talking. Okay, maybe we'll go to Larry Levine.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Larry Levine. I'm with Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, where I am the Director of Urban Water Infrastructure and a senior attorney. We're an environmental advocacy group. We work nationally at the state level, at the local level, and I am on the steering committee of Jersey Waterworks.
Great. And Dan, are you able to speak now? Kristen, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Kristen Epstein. I am the Assistant Director of Trenton Waterworks, which is owned by the City of Trenton. I've been working for Trenton Waterworks since 2018 when our new mayor took office, Reed Guciara, and we serve the city capital and the surrounding communities, about 63,000 accounts and a little over 200,000 people. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. I'll ask Dan to see if he can speak now. If not, we'll fix that. And also, Jyoti, I think the poll disappeared for folks, so if you could put that back up in the meantime, and we'll give everybody some time to complete that.
Yeah, we'll get the poll started.
Great. Okay, great. And Paul is also saying that the poll was asking what sector you represent, so you can add that in the chat. If we can give everybody the options that were in the poll, that would be great. In the chat.
So I'm going to post the poll question on the chat, and please share it via.
Okay, great. So I guess Dan's still unable to speak. If somebody could help him with that. But Dan is the Professor of Professional Practice for Water, Society, and Environment at Rutgers University School of Environment and Biological Sciences. So hopefully we'll get that fixed for him shortly. Next slide. Certainly water and sewer bills can seem low compared to other costs like home heating. So the affordability of water and sewer stress may not be as noticeable, but we know that affordability has an impact, and water has become increasingly unaffordable for many throughout our state. So let's contextualize this a bit. Kristen, how does water affordability stress impact utility operations or infrastructure upgrades like LSL replacements?
I'm sorry, is this a question or am I going into my presentation?
Yeah, go ahead. Into your presentation.
For the presentation?
Yeah.
Then I need the next slide, please. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Yes, as I mentioned, we're Trenton Waterworks. We're owned by the city of Trenton. We are not an authority. We're actually a department of water and sewer within the city of Trenton, which means all of our financial decisions are governed by our city council. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a case study of Trenton, which the city of Trenton, which many of you realize is one of our disadvantaged cities in the state of New Jersey. 2 years ago, we put forth a $405 million capital improvement plans, and this is additional spending beyond capital that we had already, capital bond approval that we had already received. So of $405 million, we were planning in 2020 to put in front of our council a total of about $108 million in capital bond ordinances. We weren't going to spend it all that year, but we were going to ask for it from our council. The items that are highlighted in red are the ones that actually got approved by our council, and the ones in black in that middle column, we put in front of them and they did not approve that. So between the capital improvement funds and the bond ordinances in red, that's what we're working with at the moment. So as you can see, it's only 3 areas: the decentralized storage tank system, which is basically replacing our open water reservoir with a series of tanks, lead and copper compliance, which is essentially lead service line replacements, and water meter replacements. Next slide. So this was setting the stage for what we did next. Is we asked our council for a rate increase, which they did approve. They approved it in, I believe, late 2019, and it was supposed to go in effect in the spring of 2020. The rate increase was to cover our first 2 years of the capital debt that we would need. We figured we would take on $6.2 million in new debt service that we would need to pay, plus some, salaries and new employees. That rate increase was $11 per month per household, which was going to give us $8.2 million per year. Now, if you remember what happened in 2020, we did not get any of that $8.2 million. In fact, our revenue coming in was actually less than years before the pandemic, despite the rate increase. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because of the Shutoff Moratorium. We can't actually collect money from folks. And the second reason, which may be even bigger, is that there are a lot of workers, county and state workers that come and work in the city of Trenton during the day and then go home to the suburbs at night. And we did not have that happen for over a year. The DEP alone, those buildings were vacant for over a year. So we didn't sell as much water. There wasn't as much water being used. Next slide. So one part of our capital plan is lead service lines. I run the program for the city of Trenton, lead service line replacements. As of today, we've replaced over 7,500 lead service lines throughout our area. We have probably about 24,000 more to go, which we estimate that's about $120 million more than what we've already spent. We've already taken on $50 million to get to the end of phase 2, which by the end of phase 2, we're going to be over 9,000 replaced. But that's already debt that we've taken on About half of it has been principal forgiveness, but going forward, we don't know how much principal forgiveness we're going to get. So, assuming we could maybe get 50% again, we expect to take on another 60 to 120 million more in debt in the next 10 years if we're going to follow the governor's mandate. But that's just one project. As I showed you on the previous slide, we have over 300 million more in other critical projects that we need to take on debt to do this work as well. Next slide. So the challenges that we have is that when there are mandated projects, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be mandated, such as the lead program, it limits our ability to decide what is our highest priority for our debt. When we have over $400 million more debt to take on, and we're not allowed to take on that amount of debt, we have to prioritize. And with mandated projects, that limits our ability to do that. We also our challenge is getting our politicians to support rate hikes. Nobody wants a rate hike, especially a mayor that's trying to get reelected or council people that are trying to get reelected. Then also, how do we collect our revenue? It's harder than ever for people to pay our bills. And that's all the time. So if we raise rates, are we ever going to be able to get that amount that we're raising the rate? And then the age-old problem is if we're taking on a loan, we can't afford the repayments. We can't refinance the house anymore to get more loan ability because we cannot repay it. So we really are in a desperate need for grants, not loans with principal forgiveness, because we can't even afford the remaining loan portion. So we're really our challenge now is to try to get as much grant money as possible. And that is the Trenton case study. Thank you so much for your time. I enjoyed being on this panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen, for sharing all of those kinds of challenges. And now I want to provide like a broader context for the conversation on affordability regarding water, and the challenges that New Jerseyans have in affording all basic needs and why that matters. Next slide, please. So this chart on the top left is from the ALICE report. ALICE is a report presented every 2 years by the United Way of Northern New Jersey, started in 2007. And now this report is actually produced in at least 20 other states as well by the United Way of Northern New Jersey to really show the growing inequality in our state and in our nation, especially for certain populations. So the blue dots represent people who are below the ALICE threshold, which is asset limited, income constrained, and employed. And the yellow dots are people who are above that threshold. And so we can see that, there are challenges, for all ages, races, and family types for falling below that ALICE threshold, which is working poor. And I always have said for almost 2 decades that working poor are 2 words that should never be heard together in the richest nation in the world, nor one of the richest states in that nation. If you're working, you should be able to afford your basic necessities. Just kind of makes sense. And we used to be able to do that in past decades. But as you can see from this chart, there are more blue dots, folks below that ALICE threshold. When we're talking about seniors, which is at 48% at or below the ALICE threshold. For Black households, it's 52%, as well as Latino households at the same rate. And for single female-headed households, that rate has fluctuated between 73 and 79% in the last few years. So at least, 3/4, if not 4/5, almost 80% of single moms can't afford basic needs all the time in our state. And also, just for context, this is information on the bottom from the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy of, unaffordability across other types of utilities. And we see that for Black households, they have a 43% higher And for Latinos, it's 45% higher. So also having your water shut off due to arrears that you can't pay, whether during the pandemic or before, because we knew water was becoming more unaffordable even prior, is a really serious issue for both individuals and families. You certainly can lose your home due to liens placed by municipal authorities. I had worked for the child welfare system in New Jersey for nearly 3 years, and I've seen parents in crisis either threatened with the removal of their children from their home due to not having active utilities or having their children actually removed from their care. And working among and in allyship with poor and homeless folks over the last 20 years, this is a parent's worst nightmare and can cause further breakdown in functioning and ability to get your children back if they are removed. It's just devastating. So next slide. And these are a couple of charts from the Pew Research Center earlier this year. For Black and Latino households, 74% of low income and 42% of middle income households were still classifying their financial situation during the pandemic as fair or poor a year into it. And overall, people who've been impacted financially are still struggling and earning less than their pre-pandemic income. And we know that folks who were cobbling together 2 or 3 part-time jobs and at least lost, 1 or 2 of those jobs and lost income, or were working full-time and had to go part-time or lost that job entirely, they're not getting that income back, right? And so the assistance that my fellow panelists will talk about later is also very critical. And also, at least 2 out of 5 renters in New Jersey were not caught up on rent as of the spring this year, and at least 1/3 of households had trouble paying their usual expenses. So we also, kind of hear sometimes that, folks have been able to pay, but because of moratoriums, they didn't. But we know also that there were increased costs to households due to the pandemic, staying at home, including, higher utility costs, and especially water with frequent hand washing and other utility usage, PPE, cleaning supplies, all these kinds of things where they had increased expenses. They may have had 1 or more family members who passed away or have ongoing health issues as a result of COVID, and have had family income losses as a result. They may be supporting other family members and friends because of critical needs they've had with rent, mortgage, putting food on the table, utilities, and other needs. And all of this has created more burdens for households to meet their normal expenses and basic needs for life, including utilities. So we're concerned and still advocating for more assistance and protections for New Jersey families and individuals. And I know Larry will go into that a little bit. So next slide. Just wanted to touch on this too, especially for Black and Latino households. This is a chart from Prosperity Now and our partners at New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. So as you can see on the left, that the gap, wealth gap for Black and Latino households nationwide is pretty big compared to white households. But in New Jersey, it's even more of a stark difference, with much lower overall household wealth for Black and Latino households compared to a huge wealth for white households of $352,000. And we know that home ownership is generally the single biggest source of wealth building for most Americans. However, home ownership has largely been denied people of color throughout, decades and centuries for people of color. So when an emergency happens, like the pandemic, with increased expenses and income losses, these families are least able to weather these crises and able to get back on track. Next slide. And lastly, I just wanted to touch on, this is one of my favorite quotes from Audre Lorde: "There's no such thing as single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives," but just wanted to touch on these interconnections of basic needs, right? We can't just give somebody utility assistance, but they and their family are still hungry. Can't just give someone food, but they're still worried about paying the rent or mortgage next week or next month, or their utilities. can't just give someone housing assistance if their income is too low or if they've lost income during the pandemic to maintain that home longer term. And they're worried about, not being able to pay next week or next month. So all of these issues are compounded if the household faces multiple large deaths as a result of a state of emergency, like a pandemic, combined with loss of full or partial income, as I said before, for the household. And solutions to water affordability must be situated within this larger context of ensuring that families and individuals have access to all of their basic needs and whether they are affordable. People need a decent wage, should have access to food and medical coverage, and are not paying, and we need to make sure they're not paying more than what is the standard percentage of income for any and all of these basic necessities like water and sewer. So that's it for me on that. And I'll turn it over to Dan and then Larry on some reasons why affordability is important to understand and focus on particularly with water. So Dan, are you able to speak now?
I certainly hope I am.
Perfect. So we've heard why affordability is important. It's really hard to find some solutions to this problem if we don't know the extent. So can you talk to what your study found in terms of findings for our state in New Jersey?
Sure, thank you. And when all else fails, reboot, which is what I did. I went offline, came back in, and now it works. So I'm Dan Van Abs. I'm with Rutgers University. I'm a professor of water, society, and environment. And for the last 4 years, I've been working with New Jersey Future and Jersey Waterworks to look at this issue of affordability with regard to drinking water and sewer utility costs. And Renee's points are an absolutely beautiful takeoff point for this study, because one of the things you have to recognize, we all recognize, is there's no such thing as a bright line for affordability versus not affordability. There's no single cost that is going to be the thing that makes life unaffordable or affordable. And yet, when we're dealing with something like the water sector, we have to understand what the water sector's component is of this overall system. So what we did is a series of reports starting in 2018 and finishing up this August on the whole question of affordability as it relates to water utility costs. Next slide, please. So the research question was, how do we understand, how do we visualize, how do we measure the affordability stresses that are related to water and sewer utility costs, drinking water and sewer utility costs? And this is based on a number of assumptions, of course. One is that people actually pay their utility costs directly, which is not true for many people who are renting. Many of them their utility costs are paid through the landlords themselves. And recognizing that this is a study that is for policy analysis purposes to help people understand the scope of the issue, but it's not something that is rigorous to the point where a utility could pick this up and say, okay, we're going to use the results for an affordability project. We would need more information from that perspective. So we're looking at the approximate number of households that could potentially face affordability issues and their distribution across the state. Next slide, please. We looked at public community water systems, which are the major water utilities that provide household waters, drinking water. We looked at sewer service areas. And these two utilities provide utility services to approximately 90% of all residents in New Jersey. We gathered rate information for a very large number, nearly 600 utilities, and those represent about 90% of all people who are served. So it's 90% of 90%, if you will. We did this based on a nominal household demand of 45,000 gallons per year, which is basically the demand that we would expect a 3-person household to need for basic needs, not outdoor watering needs, not washing your car, but indoor typical household needs. Next slide, please. This is an adaptation of a method that's been suggested nationally, the affordability ratio method from Manny Teodoro, who's with the University of Wisconsin, colleague of ours. And what we're doing is we're comparing the water utility costs to the amount of money that a household at the 20th percentile income level, in other words, the top income of the bottom fifth of household incomes in the state, in the service areas and so on. And not just to the total income, but to the household disposable income, because there are a lot of necessary costs households have as non-discretionary costs. They have to be able to live someplace. They need to have energy, utilities. They need to have transportation. They need food. And so there are a lot of non-discretionary costs that households have. You subtract that from the 20th percentile income, and you say, all right, there's a percentage of that that we would say, if the utility costs are less than that, then we would consider it not to be an affordability stress. And if it's higher than that, then it would be an affordability stress. And the percentages that we used are at the bottom left: baseline of 10%, high 20%, severe 30%. The numbers you see on the right-hand side are the number of households that we analyzed, almost 2.7 million households. And about 20% of those show that if they were paying the utility rates directly, the utility costs directly, they would be at least at the baseline affordability stress or more. So next slide, please. And this is what it looks like from a statewide perspective. The deeper the orange and red color is, the higher the percentage of households that are facing this kind of affordability stress. So we are starting from a very granular level down at the census tract or even sub-census tract level, and then you can aggregate that up to municipalities, the utility, county, or as we did with the state. 2 points that I want to really make here. One is that, as you can see from the map, these baseline affordability stresses are not confined to our older urban areas. They're not just in the cities. They're all over the place. Pretty much anywhere that we have public utilities, water utilities, you'll find some level of affordability stress. And in many places, you'll find 10, 15, 20% of households that are facing these kinds of stresses. But we did have areas, especially in some of our older urban areas, Camden, Atlantic City, Newark, New Brunswick, Perth Amboy, and so on, where the numbers were up over 40%, 45%, even close to 50% of the households. And so that gives you a sense of the severity of stress in some areas, but the map gives you a sense of also the geographic spread. So next slide, please. So here are two close-ups: the Newark area on the left-hand side and the Camden area on the right-hand side. And we outlined some utilities just to give you a sense of one other critical point, is that even within utility service areas, there is a large difference, or there can be a large difference in the amount of affordability stress. So for instance, on the right-hand side, the blue boundary is around the New Jersey American Water service area. And what you find is that there are some parts of that with very low affordability stresses and other parts with very high affordability stresses. And that's worth noting as well, because it gives you a sense of public policy approaches that could help with regard to this issue. So that's where I end my presentation, and thanks for the time.
So much, Dan. That was great. Thank you for all the great work. So now we know, we've heard about affordability, why it should matter, the extent of this problem across the state. And it can seem like a complex problem to solve, but we know there are potential solutions. So Larry, you and I have worked with others on some of these solutions. What are some state and federal proposals that can help us solve the affordability issue in New Jersey?
Thanks, Renee. So I'll start to get into the solutions portion of the discussion. And by no means is this a comprehensive list of all the kinds of policy solutions that are necessary and that can be pursued at the state and local levels in New Jersey, as well as at the federal level. And hopefully we'll have some opportunity for a robust discussion around that topic, including the panelists and all of the attendees today as well. It's a very rich and critical topic for us all to wrap our heads around. Okay, next slide. And just before we get into the specifics of solutions, just to remind ourselves, what are we trying to solve for? Right? And I think we've heard this from the prior presentations, but to really distill it, there are two things going on here. One is at the individual level of people, of families. Everyone, regardless of income, needs and deserves clean water. Clean, safe water coming out of their tap. Safe sanitation services to remove the waste from their house after they've used that water, and to keep waterways clean when that water is treated and ultimately discharged back into surface waters, lakes, rivers, coastal waters, right? Everyone needs and deserves clean water. The flip side of that coin is that to get there, every water and sewer utility needs sufficient and sustainable revenue. And the place that they look primarily for that revenue is to their customers, residential and non-residential, and they collect that revenue through the rates that they set and the bills that they charge based on those rates. And so we've got to satisfy both of those things with solutions, or neither of them will be satisfied. They're interrelated. They both have to be achieved for the other one to work. Okay, next. Okay, so here I'm going to get into some recent things that have been passed and some things that are pending. So one of the biggest things that's happened during COVID at the federal level in terms of water affordability, I suppose the biggest thing at the federal level, is the creation on a temporary basis of a water assistance program. Which is the first time ever that any federal funds have been provided for low-income water assistance. As many folks know, there is a long-standing federal program for energy assistance for low-income households called the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. That's for gas and electric, and as well as delivered fuels for heat in the winter. There has never been a program like that for water. And there's still no permanent program like that for water, but during COVID, the urgent need and the impacts, the financial impacts of COVID on low-income households for expenses across the board really compelled Congress to devote some funds to this for the first time, of $1.1 billion nationally, which is not enough to meet the full need, but it created a program that's analogous in many ways to the LIHEAP Energy Assistance Program. This came out of a pair of COVID relief bills, one in December of last year and one in the spring of this year, again, totaling a little over $1 billion nationally. And New Jersey got a $24 million allocation out of that, and we'll come back to that a little later. There's also other money that came out of federal COVID relief bills that can be used for water assistance as well as for other purposes. Right? There's the second two items on this list are housing assistance funds, emergency rental assistance for tenants, and a homeowners assistance fund, which hasn't been launched yet in New Jersey, to my understanding, for homeowners. Right? And both of those allow, the federal programs allow for states to use those dollars not only for rent or for mortgage payments, but also for utility bills that people have fallen behind on. Right? There were some dollars for FEMA for emergency purposes that I'm not sure if any state or if any of these actually were in fact used for utility assistance, but would have been eligible for it at least Be interesting actually to try to figure out retroactively whether this program did get applied for that purpose. But the last two here are sort of flexible pots of money that were provided to state and local governments. And one is from the most recent economic recovery and COVID relief bill from the spring, from early in the Biden administration, the American Rescue Plan Act, right? And this was called the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. These are billions of dollars. New Jersey got about $6 billion, many billions, 350 billion, I think, nationwide. New Jersey got about $6 billion just to the state, if I recall, and then additional money that went to cities and counties. There's a lot of discretion in those state and local governments of how to use those funds for a range of purposes, ranging from direct assistance to individuals to address the financial impacts on households of COVID, to investments in health and other programs to be responsive at the public health level to the pandemic, to addressing reduced revenues to state governments, to investing proactively in water infrastructure and broadband infrastructure and other things. And some states and some local governments around the country have chosen to use a portion of these funds for utility assistance. So for example, in Buffalo, New York, the city committed $13 million of its money to forgiving water arrears that its residents had accumulated. California committed $1 billion to water arrears statewide out of their pot of money, and I believe another $1 billion towards energy arrears as well. And this is in order to supplement the federal funds that were specifically for this purpose within the water assistance program, the energy assistance program, but which by themselves weren't enough to meet the need. Right? And the last one here, the CARES Act, that's from last year. That was sort of the equivalent of last year, that included some pots of money that were for flexible use for state and local governments. Some of that money as well has been used in some places for water assistance. Next slide. And there's a fact sheet here, a link that from NRDC and from National Consumer Law Center that summarize those programs. So here's some pending legislation. And, and actually before I realized one thing before I get into the pending legislation, the other important piece from New Jersey specifically that was enacted is by executive order, Governor Murphy created a utility shutoff moratorium, which remains in place through the end of this year. In order to, in recognition of the fact that people aren't going to be able to pay, many are not going to be able to pay those bills in full on time during this crisis, and that we can't afford to have people losing essential utility services in the pandemic, and that there was not yet sufficient financial assistance to help close that gap. So that's still in place as of now through the end of the year. But also what was included in there, which is important as well, it are things like provisions on suspending fees, late fees, and interest, and allowing for people to pay back as they hopefully get back on their feet financially, to pay back arrears over time, to the extent that financial assistance doesn't fall if and when it arrives, right? And that's something that called a deferred payment agreement. It's something that has existed for a long time for energy customers and for customers of the investor-owned, privately owned water utilities that are all regulated by the Board of Public Utilities. There are regulations for the majority of water customers, about 60% of the states served by publicly owned local government systems. There's never been a uniform statewide policy around a right to an extended payment plan when you fall behind on your bills. So that's something that was put in place by the executive order for at least for a period of time, still in effect as of now, and that actually points to the importance of not only the affordability of a bill, but also the collection practices that are used by a utility when someone falls behind. Those two things go together, right? The bill can be affordable or not affordable. We want it to be affordable, but when it's not for a particular person at a particular point in time, or as the case is now for many people in New Jersey, right? What's the consequence? And we heard from many of those consequences: loss of service, shut off, or non-payment, liens on someone's property, right, where you can actually lose your property for not paying a water or sewer bill if you're a customer of a municipality or an authority, sewerage authority, or a municipal utilities authority, right? Those are collections practices that don't have to be the way they are. They represent what the consequences are, and there are policy choices behind that of what the consequences are to an individual household at a particular point in time when they're unable to afford their bill. Okay, so back to this slide. Here are the remainder of my presentation. We'll talk about some things that are pending. I believe actually I may have a couple more on some things that passed as well. So pending in New Jersey, solutions that are not yet in place. There's a bill to authorize individual publicly owned water and sewer systems to offer discounts to low-income households. There's currently authority for them to offer discounts to certain seniors and disabled individuals who are low income, but there's not a general authority to offer low income discounts. There are many utilities around the country that do so. It's still not the majority practice in most places around the country, but there are many who do so. There's very little of that in New Jersey. A couple of the investor-owned utilities have some modest programs around that. I'm not aware of any publicly owned utility that has a low income discount, apart from, again, this disability and seniors. Right. The current law is, in my view, ambiguous on it. I think an argument could be made that there's authority to do it now, but there's a need for legislation to make that very explicit. And so this is a bill that's pending. It passed in the last session of the legislature, passed the Senate and passed two committees in the Assembly, and just didn't quite get to a floor vote in the Assembly. So I think there's pretty broad support for it, and it's starting to move again. Well, we hope it will be moving in the lame duck. It's moved a little bit in this session. We hope to get it through, and the more folks that are aware of it, the more that will help advance the bill. The second is a statewide approach, looking to create a statewide, on a permanent basis, water assistance program. Right? Congress has not yet created one nationally on a permanent basis. States have the opportunity to do so. There is no state yet that actually has done so, with the exception of one that's done it on paper with no funding for it. Illinois recently passed a law this year directing one of its state agencies to establish a water assistance program, but only contingent on actual appropriations for it. They haven't appropriated any money. Right. So this bill would, if it passed, make New Jersey the first state actually to do that, and would appropriate $75 million from those American Rescue Plan funds that I mentioned earlier, appropriate that to jumpstart the program. And importantly, that bill calls for Department of Community Affairs to develop the program design with an advisory committee, and in doing so to consider two different models that are used in the state, consider other options too, but consider the LIHEAP model, but also consider the Universal Service Fund model from the energy context, right? In which there is a specific target of 6% of combined gas and electric bills that qualifying low-income households should not be paying more, sorry, not 6% of bills, 6% of income. Qualifying low-income households should not be paying more than 6% of their household income towards gas and electric bills. And the amount of assistance is calibrated to achieve that target for each participating household. And it's funded on the energy side. It's funded through what's called the societal benefits charge. That's essentially a surcharge on gas and electric bills that goes into a pot of money that's used for multiple purposes, including household affordability assistance for energy. Right? Nothing like that exists on the water side right now either. Right? So those are two possible models that could be adapted to water. Okay, next slide. Here's some federal legislation that some that has passed, some that's pending. Right, the major thing that's passed, besides the temporary assistance program, is the bipartisan infrastructure bill, right, that we've heard so much about throughout the year. The formal name for it is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That was finally passed last month and signed by the president. included within that are three things that most directly relate to household level affordability. Although I'll say that the one that what I did not include in the bullet here that is also critically important is the amount of the money, the $50-odd billion in water infrastructure funding, about half of which needs to be in the form of grants that will be distributed to water systems, most of it through water and sewer systems, most of it through the states, but to go towards water infrastructure investments. And the more funds that can come from the federal government and from the state government that don't have to be borne by ratepayers, as Kristen said, the more we can help alleviate those affordability stresses on individual households while advancing the clean water and safe water goals. Right, so that was a big piece of that infrastructure bill. That was the infrastructure piece, right? Also within there, though, was the creation of a pilot EPA grant program for low-income household assistance, which unfortunately didn't get funding in the bill, but it directs the EPA to create a program that would give grants either directly to individual water and sewer systems or municipalities, or to states on behalf of smaller systems to be able to run localized low-income assistance programs. Right? There are also a pair of studies in that bill that are required to be done by EPA, which are relevant. One is a needs assessment study of the need nationwide for low-income water assistance, which is intended to inform further policy development and hopefully legislation by Congress. And also a study of looking back at the allocation of federal water infrastructure funds through the state revolving funds, looking back at that over time. How have those funds gone to the most disadvantaged communities where they're most needed? And if not, what are some reforms that are necessary to better achieve that goal of equitable allocation of funds? Right. Two other things that are pending. One is the Build Back Better Act. That's the other kind of key initiative of the Biden administration that the Democrats in Congress are pursuing, and that includes within it a modest amount, but $225 million to EPA for low-income household water assistance, intended to get EPA in the game and hopefully create a lasting program there. The temporary program is housed at Health and Human Services at the federal level, which runs the LIHEAP program. So there's an effort to really get on a permanent basis EPA, which is responsible ultimately for ensuring clean and safe water and sanitation from the federal level and federal policies around that, to get them in the game of helping at the household level as well. And then last, there is a bill to create permanently a more LIHEAP type program, a permanent household water assistance program. House of Representatives passed that earlier this year. It did not make it into any of the bills that are now in play in the House and Senate joint bill that passed or into Build Back Better. That's not in there as of now. Next slide. So I'll round out here with some additional policy implications of this sort of analysis that Dan has done. Right? It's there are state policy levers, there are federal policy levers, there are also local policy levers at the utility level. Right? And it's important here to keep in mind that while water affordability is situated within this larger context of poverty, that doesn't mean that from a water perspective, it's just someone else's problem to solve. If someone else in some other area of public policy or some other state agency that deals with social services, that deals with Medicaid, that deals with welfare benefits, that deals with minimum wage. It's not just someone else's problem, right? It's the utilities' problem as well, both from their financial bottom line perspective and also from the perspective of their responsibility, the reason for being of providing service to everyone, essential water and sewer services. Right. And so here are some of the things that are highlighted in another Jersey Waterworks report from a couple of years ago that came at this from a policy perspective, laying out policy options. Right. There are things like rate structure reform, right? How it's not just about how high the rates are, but about how rates are designed affects who bears the greatest burden of paying them. Local affordability programs, as I mentioned, this new state law passes, there'd be more opportunity to do that at the local level. Right? Reducing costs, being as efficient as possible by optimizing operations and management programs and capital programs at the local level. That again can reduce cost burden that gets passed on to customers. The one I've bolded here, I think one of the most important ones. This comes back again to the water infrastructure funding piece. Where are dollars going? How many dollars do we have coming from the state and the feds? But also, where are those dollars going, and how can they be directed in a way that's going to most help those communities that have the greatest challenges raising revenues because of their inability to pay of so many of their customers, right? And a couple other items here. There are many more in the report. And I would welcome you all to encourage you all to check that out on the Jersey Water Works website as well. I think that may be my last slide.
Great. Thanks so much, Larry, for that really comprehensive overview of all of the kinds of solutions that are out there for utilities and customers in New Jersey. So I wanted to encourage folks to put any questions in the Q&A feature or in the chat feature while we're talking, but I do have a couple of questions first for some of our panelists. Let me turn to Dan first. Where can folks go to learn more? What are some ways the study can be used? And why is it helpful to understand the extent of these affordability stressors?
So the study is actually posted on the Jersey Water Works website, and you can go there to take a look at it and get into all the gory details. There's a lot there, and it's a lot to absorb. But I think the critical issues are fairly straightforward. Is we do have quite sizable affordability burdens that people face either directly or through their rents that affect their ability to live decent lives. And so one of the problems that we're facing is in the United States is that water and sewer costs have been accelerating much faster than the consumer price index for decades, since about the mid 80s. And it's not too surprising because it's during that time that all of the regulatory implications of the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act came into play. And in the mid 80s, the federal grant program went away. So utilities were forced much more often to rely on loans. Also, our infrastructure is aging. And so a lot of places that built infrastructure at a time where they were densely populated, very industrialized, had a lot of revenue coming in from industrial users and so on, don't anymore. And so they're facing a need to replace their systems, to reinvigorate their collection systems, their distribution systems, and so on a much different revenue base. And so all of that is a complication. The final part is, Larry mentioned several times the LIHEAP program. It's worth noting that the LIHEAP program is based on a surcharge to regulated utilities that provide essentially 100% of the energy in this state. And there are less than 20 of them. On the water and sewer, drinking water and sewer side, there are over 1,000 individual utilities. Over 1,000. And so the administrative complexity is difficult. But not only that, a lot of these utilities are small enough that it would be very difficult for them to establish their own affordability program. The administrative costs of just setting it up would be difficult. So part of what this report drives us to is the notion that we need to deal with a very fragmented system and one with a lot of disparities within the state. And perhaps a statewide program is going to be the best approach for dealing with this issue, to avoid having one utility right next to another utility, both with the same affordability program. One has an affordability program and the other does not. So these are the kind of things that come out of this. Larry mentioned the rate structure issue, and one of the things that I'm working on right now is actually a rate analysis in New Jersey. And it's worth noting that of the 370 some sewer utilities where we gathered rates, over half of them charge a fixed charge for 100% of their rate. It doesn't matter whether you use 10 gallons or 10,000 gallons or 50,000 gallons, you're charged exactly the same amount. That's a pretty regressive approach, But if you don't have water demand information, how do you do something different? So the rate structure is really critical as well. I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks so much. So just for Larry and Kristen as well, what are some other implementation challenges around offering some of the affordability solutions we've heard about, and how do we balance those when utility revenues are impacted?
So yeah, I can take that. Larry mentioned some customer assistance programs that could be available for residents. Before I get into that, I want to mention one thing that Dan said about rates raising through the years. Our rate increase that we started in 2020 was our first rate hike in over 10 years. So again, it's a political decision in our town of whether to raise rates or not. Also, our rates, even though we raise them, are still 1/3 to 1/2 of what our neighboring New Jersey Waterworks customers pay. So our whole system is discounted, you could say, to cover, even though we have customers that could afford to pay more and we have customers that could afford to pay less, our whole system is at this discounted rate because we're one consistent rate for everyone. But back to the customer assistance, if there isn't, if we give a discount, which we do for seniors and veterans and disabilities, if we give a discount, we bear that discount. We don't get filled in from any program funding that reduction in revenue that we get. So having that funding from the state or the federal level would be critical if we're going to do some kind of a system-wide discount program, because otherwise that just reduces our revenues, which we need to do our capital projects. So as far as individuals applying for these different programs, that is very, very, very difficult hurdle to overcome. In the city of Trenton, we have a program called the Trenton Urgent Rehab Program. It's through our housing department, called TURP for short. And the folks that run that TURP program say they get people calling. That's where you can give $5,000. It's a federal program through the through HUD. $5,000 for urgent rehabs. If your water heater breaks, if your roof caves in, you can get $5,000 towards that rehab. First of all, it's retroactive. So if you have an emergency, you have to, repair the emergency and then apply for it afterwards. But they say of the applicants they get, maybe 1% of them get through all of the paperwork to get to the end and actually get the money. The paperwork for this federal program is very, very hard for a typical low-income disadvantaged customer to get through. And that's very, very sad. We have money, lots of money left on the table every single year through this program. We've even expanded it to the lead service line program so that it can cover the homeowner portion of the lead service line replacement. And we've had it available for about 6 months or so. We have not gotten a single applicant for that. And we've been advertising it. We've been sending out notices. It's on our website. We haven't gotten a single applicant because it's just too much paperwork for that homeowner or resident, not even homeowner, for the resident to bear. So without significant help for these homeowners to even, customers to understand what's available and how to get through it, and reducing a lot of the hurdles, like the paperwork that they have to produce. They have to show their tax forms. They have to show that they own the home, citizen status, things like that. If we can reduce the amount of paperwork hurdles, we'll get a lot more interest. An example of that is we are working with a group called East Trenton Collaborative. This is for the lead program. East Trenton Collaborative has a grant that will fund the homeowner portion of lead service line replacement programs. They are out there working with the people that live in their area. And the paperwork is prove that you live at this address. pretty much. I mean, that a very low level, there's no income
Right.
requirement and there's no paperwork. The paperwork is very, very minimal. So we have gotten many applicants for that program. And that has been very successful in the East Trenton Collaborative area, but that's only available for that one small region of our town.
Right. Yeah, I certainly can attest to, kind of the application and documentation barriers for low-income people in so many different programs, including the ones that you're mentioning. Larry, did you want to comment too?
A few things, and agree very much with all these points about the challenges around these programs. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a recent report from the Environmental Policy and Innovation Center, EPIC. They recently did a survey of water assistance programs at the utility level around the country, water and sewer utilities, and identified very many of these exact sorts of problems, right? The difficulty of getting customers into the program because of the many hurdles that are there. And they offered some solutions in the direction of helping to ameliorate that. A couple of the things that are important here are for a water specific assistance program, right? Not having that operate in a vacuum, but having that integrated in the outreach, in the intake, in the application process with other assistance programs, with the energy assistance programs that are out there, with other forms of low-income assistance programs, right? So it's not the responsibility just on the water or sewer utility, which frankly doesn't have the expertise or capacity typically to really administer a program like this. If it's a partner with other entities that do, with other state agencies, with other county social services agencies, nonprofit social services agencies that administer other programs, right? And related to that is automatic eligibility for people who already participate in those programs. They don't have to jump through the hoops a second time of proving eligibility for water assistance. If you're and this happens for the low-income home energy assistance program. If you are a participant in SNAP, for example, what used to be known as food stamps, the state just automatically enrolls you in LIHEAP, in the energy assistance program, right? The same kind of approach can be done in the water context, and it's around the country, it's underutilized, right? But that's a way of breaking through some of these barriers for many people. Another challenge that I'll point out, and Dan alluded to this, and it's very much, I think, becoming an issue in the temporary sort of emergency water assistance program. The balkanization of water state, the sheer number of systems, and the fact that most of them are small, that makes it a big challenge for us, even for a statewide program, able to coordinate with all those individual systems as compared to the pretty small number of gas and electric companies around the state, right? And so right now, the Department of Community Affairs is trying to get all the water and sewer systems to enter into what's called a vendor contract. I mean, these programs, the utility is known as the vendor. A vendor contract that they kind of agree to the program terms to accept funds on behalf of customers and credit them to the customer's accounts when the state program determines that a customer is eligible, right? It's sort of a basic component of these kinds of programs, of the LIHEAP program, for example, where there's state-administered energy assistance dollars. So far, I'm told by DCA, they've gotten a very, very small number of utilities that have actually engaged and signed up for that. I think, if I recall, it's something like half a dozen a week or two ago, they told me, out of the 1,000 plus in the state, right? And in part, it's because DCA doesn't typically work with these systems. They don't know DCA doesn't know them. And in part, it's just the challenge of reaching that many, but 6 is, I mean, frankly, it's just really, really kind of pathetic. And I think the onus falls, is both on the state and on water systems and sewer systems to really be taking advantage of this opportunity, to prioritize it, to recognize that there's something in it for them financially, as money would come to them, as well as for their customers who they ultimately serve, right? So that's another barrier that I just want to point out. And for any folks who are on the call who do work for or with as consultants with water, and really want to encourage you to take advantage of that program. Anyone can send me a note offline or through the conference that can reach me. I can help pass on to you the information of how to contact Department of Community Affairs about engaging in that program. Two other things just that were raised by the comments from Kristen and Dan. The concern that, and Kristen, you raised this, the concern that if you offer discounts, decrease in revenue that has got to come from somewhere, right? I actually want to challenge that notion a bit in two ways. One is that you mentioned the political, local elected official resistance to raising rates, right? Some people could pay increased rates, some can't. When you can get a low-income assistance program in place, including a discount program run at the local level, right? That actually can help elected officials feel comfortable raising rates because they can raise the rates in a way that those who can afford them will be expected to pay them. But those who can't afford them will have that rate increase mitigated or offset by some discount provided on their bills. And that's something that communities in other parts of the country have done specifically in concert with needing to make large capital investments to meet regulatory obligations. So there are communities that have faced large investments for combined sewer overflows in other parts of the country. They raised rates to pay for that. At the very same time, they established a low-income assistance program, a discount, right? To help those two things go together, to make it politically possible, to make it and to make it work, right? To not impact folks who can't afford it, but to also make the investments that benefit everybody, right? So that's one way in which I think it's important not to just think of a discount as a law of revenue. And the other is that there's, even apart from raising rates, there really is a business case, so-called, right, from the financial perspective of the utility, a business case for having affordable rates. And this has been borne out by research in the energy context. If you have bills that you're sending that people can't afford to pay and don't pay them, you're not collecting that revenue. If you send people bills that they can pay and they pay them, you're getting revenue, right? And particularly where you can do it so that the rates, where there's the cost of the so-called of the discount is offset by other ratepayers paying some marginal increase, right, that covers the cost of the reduced billing up to the participating customers. This is what happens next, right? Then you're setting up a system where you're defining your revenue needs for the year and setting your rates based on what the total revenue needs are, what the projections are of collections from customers, taking into account the different collections rates you may have from higher income versus lower income customers. And if you're charging the higher income customers a bit more, that they probably frankly don't even notice on their bill, get a very high percentage from those customers paying their bills on time. You're charging the low income customers less, and getting better collection rates from them than you would if you were charging the full freight. In the end, that's actually can be an improvement to the bottom line, including when you take into account avoided costs of collections activities. It costs a utility money to shut off, costs utility money to send the shut off notice, right? So those are saved costs as well if you get improved payment rates by low income customers who get a discount. And I'll put in a plug that we're actually, NRDC is developing with a rate consultant a tool that utilities can use to do that sort of financial analysis, to project out what the impacts would be on their bottom line of offering a low income discount. Anyone interested in that as well, I also would encourage you to contact me. We're actually working on piloting that tool with some utilities, and would welcome participation by any New Jersey utilities in that.
That's great. Thanks for all of that, Larry. Just want to encourage folks, we have about 20 minutes left, so feel free to put more questions in the chat, especially around challenges that we haven't already addressed or thought of that we haven't talked about as well in the chat. So there's a question here that I'll actually take the first stab at. In the housing sector, some local laws allow tenants to withhold rent if housing quality standards are not met. Has this ever been for residents that have contaminated water? Since they have to buy water or boil, shouldn't they be granted reprieve on their bills? And I'll just mention quickly that, habitability issues for renters is a huge concern in New Jersey. And it's pretty challenging even when renters do withhold rent because there are habitability issues in their unit. The outcomes generally are not in their favor because 90 or 95% of renters in New Jersey are not represented or have legal representation when they are in court. And oftentimes what will happen is if they do withhold rent or complain enough to the landlord will then file for eviction because they don't want to hear their complaining anymore. And so that's a real issue for renters in New Jersey. They don't have, legal representation to really kind of fight these kinds of issues. But I'll open it up to others on that question too, if you have anything.
I guess one thing I would point out is the difference between a long-term situation and a very short-term situation. Boil water orders very, very rarely are more than a couple of days, 1, 2, 3 days, something like that. And so withholding a portion of a rent for a small time period would be a real issue. Many other situations, a utility may be out of compliance, but they're under a time schedule that's imposed by DEP, where the DEP basically says, well, you're exceeding this level, but you are going to achieve it within this period of time. So are they out of compliance or are they not out of compliance? These kinds of issues, I think it would be very difficult. It's a lot different than if you have a permanent health issue in an apartment because of lack of maintenance, something like that, versus a temporary. So I think it would be very situation dependent, and who decides is a really critical issue.
Sure.
Oh, sorry, Kristen.
I was just say, as a system that has to put out those violation notices more frequently than we'd like, I would like to make the point that our water is clean and safe to drink, even when those violation notices go out. Because as you mentioned, Daniel, many times it's because of a test wasn't completed at the right time, or it's something very, very temporary. It's not something that people should feel like they can't drink our water. If we put out a boil water advisory, that's an advisory because of perhaps we missed a test. It's not that our water is unsafe. And one of my pet peeve, because I run the lead program, is that we have to put out notices about lead to our entire 63,000 customers, yet it does not affect 63,000 people. But every time someone gets that in the mail, they think, oh, Trenton Waterworks is at it again. They're doing bad water quality. Why am I paying for this water? When it doesn't affect them. And it's also not something that is a short-term concern. It's a very long-term concern when it comes to lead. I don't want to belittle lead. Lead is definitely an issue. But again, it's something that we notify everyone about when it's not a concern for everyone. And that's something that I have been challenging the DEP about, that we should do targeted mailings and targeted information instead of notifying everyone about a concern that doesn't concern them.
I'll add a little bit, on lead, the cost of bottled water, say, for when there's that issue, that arose in Newark, right? And some of what was per period of time was and the lead service lines have been nearly all removed now, right? But while that crisis was ongoing, filters provided to individual households, and so that they are able to drink that water that they're paying for safely, as well as for a time bottled water delivery, right? Was an expense borne by the city. I believe the city. I'm not sure if it's city or state or both. Right. But that, when you get a situation like that where people really cannot drink water coming out of their tap safely, I think there is an obligation on the government to make sure that they don't need to pay twice for water, for water that they're using in their homes for non-potable purposes, and which is priced at a potable water rate, right? And then pay again for bottled water, right? So there are those situations that come up. And there are situations, the Flint situation, the most notorious, although certainly not the only and not the only one of its magnitude. But the Flint situation around lead, Flint, at the same time that lead poisoned water was coming out of people's taps, folks there were actually charged the highest, among the highest, perhaps the highest water rates in the country. At the same time that the water coming out of their tap was not drinkable. Right. So and that's sort of astounding, but that was the reality there, right? And it's an interesting issue that you raised, Kristen, in terms of, and I don't want to get too far off track, but in terms of the notification of customers, and I think as lead service line inventories are done, right, which don't exist in a fulsome way in most places, as lead service line inventories are done, which is also required under the law, it seems to me that could be helpful in having more targeted notices as well. Part of the issue is we don't quite know where all the lead service lines are. And we want to make people aware that it's an issue that they may not know about, may or may not affect them, but they don't know, and they're not going to know that it's an issue to even thinking about if they're not educated about that.
Thanks, everyone. So there's a question: what would it take to revamp the paperwork requirements? Is that in law or regulation? I think that was in response to what you were saying, Kristen, earlier about the federal program, and it sounds like certainly that's a change at the federal level. But if others want to comment as well on other kind of application and documentation requirements too.
I personally really like Larry's idea of using paperwork for other programs to qualify you for water assistance programs. One of the ideas I was tossing around is anyone who has a child on free or reduced lunch in the home, then you could qualify, particularly for the lead program, you could qualify for a reduced cost or no cost lead service line replacement. But I like the SNAP idea. Why should we do things multiple times that get to the same end result? It doesn't make sense. And I'll tell you, working for a government agency, sharing data is not our forte. So that's something that as different types of municipal, state, county, federal agencies really need to improve, is how we can connect the dots for the individual so that we can, take information from the federal government and know it applies to us, from the state and from the county, and we can all share that information.
Yeah.
And that data sharing issue is another one that's coming into play right now around the low-income home water assistance program. There were the two ways in which the Department of Community Affairs is trying to interface with the utility is, one is what I mentioned before, signing these vendor contracts. But they've been trying to have what they hoped would be an efficient way of dispersing funds by having water and sewer systems share data with the state about who's in arrears and by how much, and for the state to be then able to match that up. So who gets LIHEAP, who gets SNAP, right? And again, as of a couple weeks ago, what we were told is about a dozen utilities, something in that neighborhood, have provided that data. Again, out of the 1,000 plus, right? So I don't know what explains that exactly. I mean, there's the newness of it. I'm sure there are some data management challenges that many systems face. But a dozen is a pretty small number. It's a pretty small share out of all of them. And so there really is a need to focus on this.
It's worth noting that in the vast majority of municipalities in New Jersey, the owner of the drinking water utility is not the same entity as the owner of the sewer utility. Trenton's unusual, actually. There are very, very few where that's the case. And so it increases the administrative complexities incredibly. And again, my colleague Manny Teodoro has taken a look nationally at different subsidy programs. And what he is finding is that LIHEAP is not actually reaching the majority of people who are eligible for LIHEAP. That many of these other subsidy programs are not even reaching a quarter of the people who are eligible for the program. And the one that is the most successful at reaching the people for whom it is intended is SNAP. So certainly piggybacking on that program makes a lot of sense because it's already a successful program, whereas many of the others are limited in their successes.
Yeah, absolutely. And we keep seeing monthly increases in the participation in SNAP throughout the pandemic. So certainly a great point. I'm going to ask, hopefully we have a little less than or a little over 9 minutes now, but hopefully we have time for one or two more questions. I'm going to ask this one because I'm not sure we fully answered this and I'm not sure I understand what the acronym is. So sounds like we need a new law that lets TWW charge market rates to some of their market that can afford it. Is this something that people are exploring? So is there anything else on that?
Currently exploring that.
Okay.
Like I said, it's a political decision. We several years ago stabilized our rates, meaning that every customer pays the same rate regardless of where they live or what their income is. And that was a popular decision at the time. I don't know if we're ever going to go back to changing that rate structure so that it's different. Part of the reason we did that, it is my understanding, is so that the BPU didn't have oversight of our rates, that the city of Trenton could decide, our city council and our mayor could decide when to raise rates, as opposed to having to do a rate case that we presented to BPU. If we were to separate or change the rate structure, we would then have to go through BPU. And the politicians in Trenton are not interested in relinquishing control of the Trenton Waterworks, and they see that as losing control. So that's not something that I think would be contemplated.
Right. And that was a situation where Trenton had to decide whether it was going to charge outside municipality customers differently than its own customers inside the city. But if the state were to allow a utility to have an assistance program for low-income households that would apply equally inside and outside of Trenton within the entire service area, then the politicians might see it a little bit differently, where those who can afford rates would pay them and those who can't afford rates would pay less. But who knows? You know, when you throw things into politics, you never know what's going to come out the other side.
The corollary is that the messaging has to be correct for both the politicians to understand what we're trying to do, and then they be able to convey that to the people that might be voting for them. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very good solution. I just don't know if that would be realistic in the city of Trenton.
And it would not work in all municipalities either, because I constantly raise the issue of a certain city in southern New Jersey where the median income, not the 20th percentile income, the median income is about $25,000, right? Mm-hmm. And so you would have the poor subsidizing the poorer. Mm-hmm. And is that really going to solve anything? And I would suggest no, it won't. So that's where you have need for a higher level program. And the really difficult question is, where does the money come from to provide those subsidies when you have a system with over 1,200 individual utilities?
Yeah, and to the question about, are there, I think the question may have included are sort of legal changes or policy changes to facilitate it. There is the bill that I mentioned earlier, which is A2846 in the Assembly, that would specifically give discretion, right, to publicly owned water and sewer systems to offer low-income discounts. And I mentioned also on the side of the investor-owned water systems that serve about 40% of the state, those that are entirely regulated by the Board of Public Utilities, the law actually does allow for them to do that if they allow for them to cross-subsidize basically within their customer base, charge some customers less based on their being low income, and offset that with sort of marginal increase to costs for those who can't afford to pay. It's underutilized by those utilities. They do have the authority to do it. BPU does have the authority to approve it. It's underutilized there, and that is something that can be addressed without need for legislation. That can be addressed by a more proactive approach from those utilities and from BPU.
Just to clarify, that's 40% of the drinking water customers, not wastewater. Wastewater is almost not at all investor-owned utilities. So, yeah.
Great. So we're almost out of time, but one more question. Kristen, can you comment on how a statewide low-income customer assistance program for drinking water and wastewater might affect local political support for capital investments in water in Trenton?
How, I think, again, it's the messaging and the understanding of what is trying to do both by the politicians and the constituents. It would need to be done carefully because to have the assistance, we also need to raise the rates or do something about the rates. And that's just a very touchy subject because that's seen as like a tax. No politician wants to raise taxes the year they're trying to get reelected. So it's something that I look forward to getting more guidance on that. I really do, because I think that could be part of the solution is this, customer assistance. But it needs to come, like I said, that we cannot reduce the amount that we're collecting from folks or asking from folks without getting the money from somewhere else, whether that's from our higher income customers or it's from some kind of an assistance program from the state. We need that. And as I pointed out through the pandemic, we're more in the hole than we were if we had never raised the rates. Raising the rates was actually inconsequential to our revenue the last 2 years, which we were and we've taken on the debt that we were planning to take on. So we are taking on this debt, particularly lead service lines, and we didn't realize the revenue we needed to pay the debt back. So we're going into 2022 in a hole, which we expected to be about even. So we are in a very tough situation as far as being able to offer discounts and things like that.
Thanks. So with a couple minutes left, I just wanted to wrap up and ask for like a quick one sentence response to this. So we have, a kind of a rare opportunity. Certainly the pandemic helped us with this to solve many legacy issues in water infrastructure. In just one sentence, what do you want to leave folks with in terms of a takeaway on affordability?
So I'll give it a shot. And my answer would be, we're going to spend this money whether we want to or not. And the question is, how much of a burden are we willing to place on people who really can't afford it?
Thanks. Kristen?
My takeaway is it's got to be grant money. We can't get loans with principal forgiveness. It has to be grant money.
Larry?
I'll come back to a point I made earlier that it's not someone else's problem, right? From the water sector perspective, from the water utility perspective, from everyone who works in the water sector, it's a poverty problem, but it's not. That doesn't mean it's just someone else's problem. It's a problem we all need to recognize and address within the water sector with the things that we can do within our control.
Sure. And I'll just quickly add that I think we should all be thinking about all of the economic challenges and basic needs that an individual or family has when thinking about these solutions as well, and taking into consideration financial situation. So I think next slide. So thank you all for participating, and thank you especially to the panelists for all this wonderful information. Thank you to the participants for great participation in the chat and great questions. So the next workshop is at 11 a.m. And participate in the Jersey Water Check Scavenger Hunt. The question will be in, I believe. So thank you again to everyone.
Pitch one more time for that. It was in the chat for the sign-on letter.
Yes,
Waterworks
thank
is
you.
organizing.
Yeah. Thanks for moderating, Renee. Great job.
Thank you all.